I grew up believing there were places in the world designed so precisely that nothing unexpected could ever slip through. The suburban neighborhoods north of the capital, where the lawns looked measured by rulers, the cars parked in perfect lines, and children were taught to say thank you before they ever learned to ask why. Ashcroft Academy was one of those places. It seemed built not so much to educate, but to preserve a certain kind of order. There, kids could name senators before they learned to tie their shoes. And among those children was a boy named Miles Gaines, black, soft-spoken, with wide, innocent eyes. He only ever answered to one person, his homeroom teacher, Mrs. Brenner. "My dad works at the Pentagon," he told her one day. The class laughed. They thought he was lying. No one bothered to find out the truth, until one crisp autumn morning, when that father walked through the school gates in a sharp suit, wearing a cold steel badge from the Department of Defense. That day, a few small things began to change. Before we return to the story, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I'll be sharing another inspiring story you won't want to miss. North of Washington, D.C., where grand estates hide behind rows of fern-covered walls and quiet cobblestone lanes, Ashcroft Academy stands as a symbol of legacy and privilege. Founded in the early 20th century, the school is more than just an educational institution. It's the discreet playground of the ruling class, where the children of senators, lobbyists, and corporate executives are groomed to inherit their parents' positions. Each morning, the wrought iron gates, engraved with a bronze-plated crest, swing open to welcome sleek convoys of SUVs, most bearing license plates registered in gated communities far removed from the noise of everyday life. Among those cars, on that particular Monday morning, a silver-gray Ford Taurus came to a slow stop at the gate. No one paid it any attention, not because it was unremarkable, but because it didn't belong. A boy stepped out, small-framed, wearing a crisp white shirt and carrying a worn canvas backpack. He didn't rush through the gate like the other kids. Instead, he paused and looked back at the man behind the wheel. The man didn't get out. He simply rolled down the window and said in a firm, low voice, "Remember what I told you." The boy nodded, eyes fixed on his father, then turned and walked through the courtyard without looking back. His name was Miles Gaines, 11 years old, a fifth grader at Ashcroft, and the only black child of his grade. His father, Robert Gaines, was a senior official of the National Security Agency, but at Ashcroft he was just the dad who drives an old car. No one asked. No one cared. At Ashcroft, the boy's presence was like a question mark no one bothered to answer. He was bright, quiet, excelled in class, never caused trouble, but he was always on the outside of weekend gatherings and group presentations with pre-assigned roles. On the school grounds, he was a solitary figure among neatly pressed uniforms and polished shoes. Not because he didn't belong, but because no one there believed he had a right to. That morning, the homeroom teacher, Mrs. Brenner, a white woman in her 40s with a southern accent as soft as velvet, announced the week's presentation topic, "What Our Parents Do for a Living." The class lit up. Boasts of doctors, lawyers, and CEOs buzzed across the room. When she asked who wanted to go first, Miles raised his hand, for the first time all year. He stood and spoke clearly. "My father works at the Pentagon. He's in charge of national cybersecurity." Silence. Then came laughter. Not the amused kind, but the kind that says, "Yeah, right?" Mrs. Brenner squinted, lips curling into a polite but condescending smile. "Oh, that sounds very important. Are you sure about that?" Miles only nodded. She glanced down the class roster, where all it said was Robert Gaines and a phone number. No title, no company, no degree. In the world of Ashcroft, that was proof enough of a child's fib, a desperate attempt to fit in. When I reviewed the school's internal files a few days later, I noticed something striking. Before that day, no one at Ashcroft had ever looked up Robert Gaines in any database. No one knew who he was, and more importantly, no one thought they needed to. That invisibility, as I would soon witness, was only a thin layer of ice covering a quake waiting to erupt. When Miles Gaines sat down after his brief presentation, the room still buzzed with faint chuckles and sideways glances, equal parts doubt and mockery. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from Mrs. Brenner, the one person who was supposed to remain impartial, someone meant to encourage student confidence. Instead of offering thanks or a word of support, she jotted something down in her notebook, gave a lukewarm nod, and turned to the next child, the daughter of a real estate investor currently lobbying Congress. The room brightened with laughter again. No one remembered what Miles had said. Some kids may not have believed it ever happened at all. Still, a strange kind of silence began to follow Miles like a shadow. In the hallways, at lunch, even during recess, he became a subject of quiet conversation. Not because of his grades or behavior, but because of a claim that felt too big for a black kid from an unremarkable neighborhood. I read the internal note Mrs. Brenner sent to the vice principal that afternoon. It said, "Student Miles Gaines provided unverifiable information about his parents' occupation. Recommend further observation to ensure honesty." Possibly indicative of attention-seeking behavior. Attention-seeking. Those two words get used more often than people realize in elite schools, especially when referring to students whose last names don't ring familiar with donors, the media, or political circles. As for Miles, he said nothing. No excuses, no complaints. At dismissal, he left class early, heading straight for the gate where the Ford Taurus was already waiting. As usual, Robert Gaines didn't get out. He just unlocked the doors remotely and watched his son in the rearview mirror. Miles tossed his backpack into the back seat and closed the door, but didn't buckle up right away. He sat still, looking out the window. "Dad," he said, voice unusually deep for his age. "She didn't believe me." "No one did. I told them you worked at the Pentagon," and they laughed. "They think I made it up." Robert didn't respond right away. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The engine idled with a low, steady hum. "And what about you?" he finally asked, his voice calm, almost cold. "I told them you'd come to parent night." "To prove it." Robert glanced at his son, not with the look of someone caught off guard, but of someone who had always known this moment would come and was ready. "All right," he said. Then he turned the car around and pulled out of the lot, as if something had just begun. That night, neighbors noticed something different at the Gaines household. The lights didn't come on as early as usual. The curtains stayed drawn. A few people claimed they saw a black SUV parked across the street for over an hour. Headlights off, a figure inside watching the house without moving. A child can imagine many things. But SUVs don't come from imagination. And the kind of people who drive those vehicles, in silence, unseen, don't work in grocery stores or building security. The boy was telling the truth. But he spoke the truth in a world that didn't believe the truth could come from where he stood. And that was when everything began to shift, slowly, quietly, like the tremble of ground just before it cracks. 9:13 p.m. Miles Gaines sat by his bedroom window, the glow from his desk lamp falling across his face as he closed his books, though his eyes hadn't left the street in front of the house. It was a quiet road, lined with homes that had front steps, a few wilted flower beds, and mailboxes marked with brass house numbers. A typical middle-class neighborhood, not busy enough for crime, but not quiet enough to avoid being watched. Miles saw it first. The black SUV, sleek and unmarked, parked at an angle across the street. The license plate was hard to read. No one got out. The interior light was faint, just enough to reveal a shadowy figure inside, but not the face. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The engine was still running. The person inside wasn't smoking, didn't move. Miles stood, stepped away from his desk, and quietly went downstairs. Robert Gaines was in his office, a small room sectioned off with a wooden door where no one entered without knocking 3 times. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out. Miles knocked gently. "Dad," he said, "there's a black car outside. It's been there a while. Someone's inside. I think they're watching the house." For a brief second, Miles saw his father's eyes shift, from focused on the computer screen to something sharper, more alert. Robert rose without a word and walked into the living room, drawing back one side of the curtain. One glance, just enough to confirm. Then he turned, grabbed his phone, and dialed a short number, not saved in his contacts. When the line connected, he skipped the greetings. Black SUV, Chevy Suburban, across from 3427. Interior light still on. Check if it's one of ours. No one in the house spoke for the next 5 minutes. Robert just stared at the phone, waiting for a response. When it came, it was a single message, not ours. No authorized units in that area. He exhaled softly, not out of relief, but to brace himself for something worse. Then he turned to his son. Lock the back door. Close all the curtains. Don't say anything to your mother. Miles didn't ask questions. He just did as told. When he reached the back door, he noticed his hands trembling slightly. But along with the fear came something else, something sharper. For the first time, his fear had been acknowledged. His worry was real. And his father, the man his classmates thought worked in a storage room, was acting like someone who had spent his life being watched. That night, Robert didn't sleep. Neither did Miles. They didn't speak, but the silence between them thickened, like winter fog settling over a field. And in that silence, Miles began to understand that there was a hidden part of his family's life. Not because his father wanted to keep secrets, but because in this world, some truths aren't allowed to be told easily. Friday morning. The sky above the Ashcroft campus was unusually clear, not a single cloud in sight. The season's first chill slipped through rows of maple trees shedding their leaves, casting a golden-brown hue over the parents' parking lot. It was Parent Day, a long-standing tradition where elite families were paraded like living business cards of the school. At Ashcroft, it was more than just a meet and greet. It was an unspoken social audit. By 8 a.m., the luxury SUVs began to roll in. Fathers in cashmere coats and mothers in hand-embroidered midi dresses strode down the red brick path leading to the main hall, exchanging handshakes and calling each other by title: Senator, Executive Vice President, Chief Financial Officer. Every glance was a performance, and everyone was quietly measuring who showed up with whom. Miles Gaines stood quietly in the corner of the courtyard, gripping the strap of his backpack. He didn't speak, but his eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a familiar figure. He knew his father would come. He'd promised. But he also knew Robert Gaines had never once stepped through these gates before. Gates where, just days earlier, his presence had seemed unimaginable. Ms. Brenner, dressed in a cream blouse and navy skirt, stood at the classroom entrance, greeting students and parents. She shook hands with each guest, offering the standard-issue smile, warm enough to seem kind, reserved enough to maintain control. When she saw Miles standing alone, something flickered in her expression, quiet satisfaction. Behind him, a few students whispered, "His dad's not coming." Then, from the far end of the parking lot, a silver Ford Taurus pulled in, neatly sliding between two gleaming Range Rovers. The door opened. Robert Gaines stepped out, gray suit, crisp white shirt with a stiff collar, black tie, polished shoes, and the unmistakable presence of someone who didn't need an introduction. Pinned to his lapel was a small, stainless steel badge, engraved with the insignia of the United States Department of Defense. Ms. Brenner spotted him from a distance. Her expression loosened for a moment, then tightened again, as if her brain was scrambling to recalculate the role of the man walking toward her. Her lips twitched once, then settled into a flustered smile. "Mr. Gaines, welcome to Ashcroft," she said, her voice missing its usual confidence. Robert shook her hand once, firm and direct. His gaze didn't flinch. "Thank you for taking care of Miles." I stood nearby, watching every gesture. The handshake wasn't long, but it was enough to redraw the lines. From someone suspected of being a janitor or a driver, Robert Gaines had just stepped into the very heart of a system that had previously dismissed him by default. That morning's classes began under a different air. The students who had laughed now kept their heads down, avoiding Miles's gaze. Ms. Brenner stood at the front of the room, flipping through her grade book, then looked up. "We'll be having a special presentation this morning," she said, her voice noticeably measured. "Mr. Gaines, Miles's father, has agreed to speak to the class about his work." Every head turned, eyes locking on the man walking up to the front of the room. In that moment, the silence wasn't just surprise, it was the sound of prejudice colliding with fact. Robert Gaines stood at the front of the classroom, composed and deliberate. His words were clear, his delivery concise, nothing wasted. He didn't use visuals or flashy PowerPoint slides. His voice was low, steady, and convincing. "My job," he said, "is to protect the government's critical information systems from defense data to the networks controlling our infrastructure. We live in a world where the first shot in a war isn't fired from a gun, but from a line of code. The class was utterly silent. Even the most restless students sat still, as if they were in a classified strategy briefing at the Pentagon. But the presentation came to an abrupt halt when a notification vibrated on his phone, a device normally banned on campus, but allowed in this one exception: Robert Gaines. He glanced at the screen for exactly 1 second. From where I sat, I caught a glimpse of the red icon. Alert. Ashcroft. Priority protocol triggered. He stepped away from the podium and moved quickly into the hallway. Ms. Brenner looked like she was about to ask something, but was stopped by a firm glance from the headmaster, who had received the same alert. The two men exchanged a few brief words before Robert pulled out his phone and dialed a secure code. I'm initiating an internal level 2 alert. Ashcroft campus. Maintenance floor. Dispatch the response team immediately. Beneath the polished exterior of a prestigious school, where the worst threats were presumed to be bad grades or seasonal flu, a suspicious device had been discovered during a routine electrical systems check. The internal facilities team, more accustomed to flipping breakers and replacing light bulbs, had reported an unclaimed backpack resting near the main circuit panel in the east basement. There were no tags on the outside, but the handle was dusted with metal shavings, a detail familiar only to those with experience in planting electronic devices. By the time Robert and the response team reached the area, the hallway had already been sealed off. 2 internal security officers stood guard but refused to approach. Robert didn't hesitate. He ordered all students to be moved upstairs, the elevators disabled, and the signal scan team deployed. I need to know, is it just an abandoned bag? Or is it the first warning? His voice wasn't raised, but it carried weight, enough to silence dissent. 3 minutes later, the analysis came back. A signal was transmitting from inside the backpack. Not a detonation signal, but a data stream. Someone had planted a high-grade listening device into the school's electrical system. Could it be operating on its own? One agent asked. Robert shook his head. No device just happens to tap into SCADA, unless it's being directed externally. And Ashcroft, as we all know, is the perfect hub for high-level intel. Kids' emails, family schedules, internal communications. They're not hacking the Department of Defense anymore. They're going around it, through the children. The air in the basement grew thick. A technician unplugged the device and sealed it in a secure case. Another agent checked the building's security footage. 2 hours earlier, a man in a maintenance uniform had entered the area, but he wasn't on the duty roster. What's his name? Robert asked. The answer came 10 seconds later. Unknown. Not school personnel. Likely an implant. Robert tightened his grip on the weapon slung under his coat. The school's systems had been compromised. There was no doubt now. What he had feared most had come true. The war he'd kept outside his front door had now crossed into his son's classroom. The Ashcroft basement remained sealed off for nearly an hour. During that time, no teachers or students were officially informed. On the surface, the school grounds carried on as normal. Bells rang, children played, parents chatted, and festive music drifted from the public speakers. But beneath that calm exterior, a high-speed analysis was underway. Data streams pulled from cameras, network routers, and technical control panels. The NSA's cybersecurity unit had arrived. A specialized team, no badges, no logos, working in silence. Robert Gaines stood among them, no longer just a parent, but the tactical lead in an active security incident. The first confirmed piece of intel brought a heavy stillness over the team. The device inside the backpack wasn't just recording and transmitting audio. It was connected to 3 additional nodes on campus, all of them classrooms. Specifically, the computer lab, the principal's office, and room 5B, the classroom where Robert's son, Miles Gaines, attended every day. Robert didn't need to ask why. Years in intelligence had taught him this. Those targeting sensitive personnel rarely start with classified files. They begin with the easiest points of entry: personal email, home networks, and, as in this case, their children's classrooms. The next question was, since when? The answer came from the system's log files. The device had begun transmitting 4 days ago, right after Miles gave his presentation about his father's job. That timing was no coincidence. Robert stared at the laptop screen. His expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. "They're not watching the school," he said quietly. "They're watching my son." Ashcroft's principal, Mr. Carlson, turned pale. His voice cracked. "You're saying someone is targeting a student?" "In my school." "Not just a student," Robert replied. "The one child whose father has Level 4 access to the National Cyber Defense Network." The truth dropped like a hammer. Every eye turned toward him. In that moment, no one remembered the suspicions they'd once had about him. Only the fear that a threat had been among them all along, and they'd never seen it. A field agent entered the room, face tight with urgency. "We've confirmed it," he said. "The man posing as a maintenance worker, the one who planted the device, left the campus about an hour ago through the West Service Gate. The name he used was Raymond Bell, but there's no one by that name in the school's personnel database. He's likely a foreign operative." Robert wasn't surprised. Given the speed of deployment and the precision of the placement, this man wasn't new to the game. More importantly, he knew he'd been discovered, which meant Robert knew exactly what would come next. He pulled out his phone and dialed home. No one picked up. His gaze dropped and then sharpened like steel meeting flame. "Where's Miles?" A nearby officer responded. "We've confirmed he was last seen in room 5B. But a school security guard said he didn't see the boy leave during recess." "Didn't see, or he wasn't there?" Robert asked, his voice low but direct. "Activate an internal search protocol. Lock down all gates. Review every vehicle that exited in the past 30 minutes. I was standing next to him in the hallway that day. I remember his voice wasn't loud, but everyone obeyed it instantly. In the span of just a few minutes, Ashcroft ceased to be a school. It became a crime scene, and everyone inside began to realize the only thing separating a prestigious academy from a terrorist target might be a single innocent presentation from child. 2:18 p.m. Miles Gaines's name was called over the loudspeaker 3 times. No response. Ms. Brenner, now pale as paper, trembled as she confirmed. The boy had left class after lunch, asking to use the restroom, and never came back. Robert said nothing. He simply reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, ultra-thin charcoal gray laptop. No logo, no markings. As he moved swiftly down the main hallway, he opened the device and began typing a long string of code without once looking at the keyboard. The screen displayed a single encrypted interface with one icon, signal trace enabled. Beside me, an NSA agent leaned in and whispered, "What's he doing?" I answered, "Finding his son." The smartwatch Robert had given Miles for Christmas, ordinary in the eyes of others, was actually a military-grade tracker embedded with a chip capable of transmitting for 72 hours, even without network access. No one knew that but Robert, not even Miles. The signal blinked on screen. Strong. Clear. Location, eastern suburbs. 27 miles from Ashcroft. An abandoned warehouse. At that same moment, a transport truck was reported leaving through the school's rear service gate, 15 minutes before Miles's disappearance was noticed. The license plate was fake. Security camera footage had been blurred by a temporary signal jammer. Robert looked up. His voice turned to steel. "I need an intervention team immediately. Target location is Warehouse 18, Silo Ridge Compound. We might still be on time." An agent hesitated. "We don't have command clearance yet. We need to go through regional security protocol." Robert cut him off with a look that could carve stone. "That's my son, and the target of an operation aimed at the U.S. cyber defense system. If anyone wants to wait on red tape, they can call their lawyers. I'm going to get my kid." No one stopped him after that. 3:05 p.m. 3 vehicles pulled out of Ashcroft in complete silence, gliding down the freeway like ghosts in daylight. Robert rode in the front seat, earpiece in place, hand resting on his sidearm. His face was no longer that of a worried father. It was the face of a seasoned operative, preparing for what might be his final mission. Silo Ridge had once been a Cold War-era industrial storage site, now abandoned, decaying, riddled with squatters and rusted-out machinery. Warehouse 18 sat deep in the back, surrounded by knee-high weeds and fresh tire tracks in the dirt. The signal from Miles's watch had remained static. No movement for 26 minutes. That could only mean one of two things. He was hiding, or he'd been restrained. Robert didn't wait for a breach order. He signaled the team to split. Then he moved ahead alone, slipping in through a side door, barely ajar, its rusted hinges groaning faintly. Inside, darkness, damp air, dust, and the tang of oxidized metal. A voice echoed from behind a stack of crates. "You're right on time, Gaines." A man stepped out, tall, lean, salt and pepper hair, eyes gray and lifeless. Robert recognized the face instantly. Anton Varek, former Eastern Bloc operative, listed for elimination over a decade ago. "Still using the old-school hostage routine?" Robert asked, taking one step forward. "No," Varek smiled. "This time I just want to talk. And I need something. Classified schematics of the satellite communications grid. You send them. I release the boy." Or a noise, a subtle tilt of the head. One of the agents had moved into position behind him, but Varek knew. He always knew. Robert spoke. "Where is Miles?" The answer came in a gesture. Varek raised a hand. From the shadows, Miles was pushed forward. His hands were lightly bound, but he was conscious. His eyes locked on his father's. No tears, just a small nod, as if to say, "You came." At that precise moment, Robert drew his weapon and fired a warning shot, clean, sharp, just past Varek's ear. "This isn't a negotiation," he said, stepping forward, each word like a hammer. "This is the end." There were no gunshots that day. No headlines about a raid at Silo Ridge. The rescue was executed cleanly, quietly, leaving nothing behind but encrypted reports filed directly to NSA headquarters. But for Robert Gaines, the only thing that truly mattered had been recovered: Miles. The boy was found in a secondary storage room, hands lightly bound, unharmed. He sat against a stack of cardboard boxes, eyes clear, not a single tear on his face. When Robert stepped in, Miles said just one thing: "I knew you'd come." They held each other in silence. No explanations, no tears, just a promise left unspoken. "I will always find you, wherever you are." The next day, Ashcroft reopened. No one was allowed to talk about the incident. Parents received a carefully worded email, calling it an internal security drill. Hallway camera malfunctions were technical glitches. Local police were never officially notified. But nothing at Ashcroft felt the same. Ms. Brenner requested a private meeting with the Gaines family. For the first time, her voice had lost its practiced tone. "I was wrong," she said. "Not just about Miles. About you too." Robert nodded. He didn't say "I forgive you," because he didn't need to. Those who have lived on the edge of justice know that sometimes quiet change is the only apology that matters. A few days later, I saw Robert and Miles again at a quiet cafe in Arlington. Miles was hunched over a tablet, adjusting lines of code. Robert sat across from him, a cup of coffee in hand, eyes fixed not on the screen, but on his son. I asked Miles one final question. "After everything that's happened, who do you think you'll become?" He looked up, no hesitation. "I want to work in cybersecurity, like my dad, but I'll do it my way. I'm going to start with schools like Ashcroft." I glanced at Robert. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. Something inside him, that hardened, ever-alert core, eased just for a moment. "I know," Miles added, "my dad's job is dangerous, but I'm not afraid. I've seen what he does and why he does it." That night, their small house in Arlington was quiet again. Curtains drawn. The Ford Taurus still parked in its usual spot. But this time, there was a black SUV at the end of the street, official federal, assigned by the protection unit. Robert checked the home security system one more time. Old habits die hard. Before bed, he paused at his son's door. Through the crack, he saw Miles fast asleep, hands still resting on the tablet screen. On it, glowing softly, were the words: "Project Griffin, School Security Framework." An idea, a new dream. Robert gently closed the door and returned to his room. For the first time in months, he turned off the lights before midnight. Outside, the streetlights remained on, but inside him, the darkness had receded. He was no longer the man behind the iron door. He was a father, present, unshaken, and seen by his son with the kind of gaze the world had once denied him.